Right, knight versus rook, and when the knight is stronger than the rook. The first situation you might imagine that the knight is stronger than the rook is if the position is very closed, so there are a lot of pawn chains about. You probably need the side with the knight to have maybe an extra pawn or possibly two, and if the position is very closed and there's nowhere for the rook to get in, the knight's no worse and sometimes better than the rook. So I've already covered this position, for example, where white is winning, but it was very hard for white to win. This was a game from 1958, and it was like, well, how is white breaking in? And white did break in, and I went through after rook e1, knight d6. The player with the white pieces at the time imaginatively broke through with b5. The engine was also back here, saying that we can play rook f1, and then this h4 move at an opportune time, and white can eventually get there. But the point is that this position's still kind of quite closed. I mean, we haven't really got pawn chains, but we have got locked pawns. And, after rook e1, knight d6, one perfectly sort of plausible line that we might see is something along the lines of rook e5, knight f5, that's why the knight came to d6. And if white insists on sort of repairing this g4 pawn push, black plays g4, and that position's now just completely drawn. So in the space of like two or three perfectly reasonable moves, you would think white's chucked away what was, if they played it well, a winning position, and it's just now a draw. And that draw has come from the fact that it's a closed position with these locked pawns, and in some ways you could argue the knight is stronger than the rook, or just as strong as the rook. So that's kind of fairly obvious, and in fact Dvoretsky doesn't really even give an example of a position, I think he calls it strewn with pawn chains, where the knight is then going to be better than the rook. But the other main case where you're going to get the knight is better than the rook is if there are particularly far advanced passed pawns that are supported by the knight. Like the rook has very good mobility, but if you've got a passed pawn that you need to deal with that's supported by the knight, the rook's kind of tied down to a very local area of the board, and needs to try and, the rook's full power isn't being used because the rook's sort of having to sort out these pawns. I went through my last 100 games. There was one game I immediately thought of on knight versus rook. But I went through my last 100 games, and there are just none of them have ended in knight versus rook. So, one sort of criticism of like all the endgame work we might do on our chess is like, yeah, but how often do you actually get that position? And I've talked many times, and I'm not going to do it again now, on how that's not the only question that we should be asking. Just to claim that the only benefit you get is if that position comes up in one of your games. I just don't think that's true. I think the transferable skills argument's very strong, the power of the pieces and so on. But also, if you get those positions in your games, then it's very obvious why we should be studying, for example, rook versus knight. But the reason that the one time I've recently had rook versus knight stood out is because it was a game against a grandmaster. I was white, and I'm playing Mark Hebden, who's a grandmaster. Again, I'm reasonably sure I'm talking mostly to Derbyshire chess players, probably Belper chess players, but we know who Mark Hebden is, a grandmaster who plays on the Congress scene locally. He's always there, or he's there for a lot of congresses. And if I play well in an open, eventually I'm going to have to play him. And I did have to play him recently in a congress back in April, and I did pretty well actually. I got to move. This is move 45, and Mark's just played this b4 move. And now I went wrong. So you could pause the video here if you wanted to, and decide what would you do as white. What would your next move be? Because I was a little bit worried, to say the least, about these passed pawns supported by the knight. That's the Dvoretsky writes that that's a problem. That's when the rook can start to struggle against the knight, when there's a passed pawn supported by the knight. So I was a bit worried about that. But this position is objectively drawn, so I had the right idea in my head with my next move. or my next but one move, but it should have been my next move and not my next but one move. I shouldn't be worried about this. I should be worried about two connected excuse me, passed pawns. I just didn't put enough thought into this move. And I mean, my idea was, I snatched on b4, I swapped the pawns, and then I played e7. And I probably just didn't put enough thought into it, didn't analyse it far enough. I didn't expect that, you know, black would take on e7 and let me take on b4. And then, excuse me, I'd have like the draw that I was quite happy to take at this point. Instead, sorry, that is what I did. But instead of taking on e7, Mark just sort of calmly dropped the king back to d7, and now I'm in a bit of trouble. Okay, my next move was even worse. I should have just given up on the e7 pawn and played something like king e1, king takes e7, and brought my king across. You know, just sort of desperately trying to deal with these. I've always got the problem that these two over here could create another passed pawn, but, you know, black is winning this but only by 80% of a pawn, apparently, according to the digital oracle. Instead, I brought my rook to e1 to defend the e-pawn, and after Mark sort of calmly dropped the king back to e8, I realised I was in big trouble. I needed to realise a bit earlier that I was in big trouble if I swapped on b4 and went for this line. Yeah, so I went 45 moves with him, completely drawn position. I've now gone 48 moves with him, and it's lost. It's completely lost. And the knight is just stronger than the rook here because it's supporting, you know, we can see that knight's in a pretty good position, ready to support the advance of those pawns, which is what happened. I'll just go through the rest of the game just quickly, and then we can get back to the original position and think about, okay, what should I have done? Because it wasn't like I had the wrong idea. I had the right idea. I just was missing other pretty important right ideas. So king e2, a pawn got pushed, rook to a1 just to temporarily stop the advance of the b pawn. I was hoping at this stage for b3. b3 is a perfectly plausible move that you might see. Sadly, not from Mark. Although, as it happened, it's black still winning this. What I was hoping for was b3. You know, because black might get excited and play b3, thinking, "Aha! I've won your rook," because that was the only way to stop the b pawn. And then the knight comes in and has won the rook. But actually, then the white king goes over here and gobbles up the two black pawns, and that's all I was interested in. And after the game, when I was chatting to Mark outside about the game, he said he rejected this line because he'd seen these same moves as well. I'm not sure if he then looked into it more deeply. And you know, if he didn't have his other move that he played, he might have looked into it more deeply and thought, well, actually, black's still just massively winning this. King back to h4, king f4, white's still dead. Okay, so black's still winning that anyway. So when I played this rook a1 hoping for b3, in fact b3, black's still winning. But Mark rejected b3 for the reason of seeing that same line that I'd seen, and just brought the knight into c3. It's a much simpler win, to be honest. King d2. Knight went back to b5. That was a good move that I hadn't seen. King to c2. Knight back into d4 with check. King b1. Look at this. What a sad situation this is. Calmly took the e7 pawn. And I'm just paralysed. I mean, I played king a2, but now b3. And I just resigned. That's obviously completely lost. But let's go back to the original position where I had the right idea, but was missing other key right ideas. And the main thing I was missing is you cannot do this. You cannot give the side with the knight right in the middle of the board, a really well placed knight, these two connected passed pawns. You know, and it was almost like I didn't consider it. I think I was worried about b3. I wasn't really worried about this move. I was worried about b3. But basically I should have employed this deflection plan straight away. Okay, and that sort of forces the issue. If knight takes e7, that's pretty simple. I can just take on b4. In fact, if black takes here, I'm winning. Okay. White's now winning that position. That's a winning version of rook versus knight. This pawn's going, and I carry on and I try and win that. Not saying I would have succeeded, but I definitely would have tried. And in fact, this position's still just pretty much drawn. Black doesn't retake on b4. Black would just calmly bring a knight back to d5. We'd see a take here, and now the black king and knight are still supporting this pretty dangerous pawn. I'm probably going to lose the rook for the pawn, but at least I'm going to gobble up those two, and that's going to head towards a draw. So it's great if knight takes e7 hits the board, but if e7, I mean, it's still very hard to play for white, but it's certainly a lot easier than what I did in the game, which was just lost. King d7, but the point is that these two pawns are still on the board, and now I can start undermining the defense of b4 with something like d4. If black plays b3, I think that was the move I was worried about. If I didn't deal with this tension here, I just thought b3. I think I made the mistake of, oh yeah, b3, and I'm never going to get anywhere there. And then I stopped analysing. That classic mistake of you just stop analysing a variation because you just see something and it just looks bad, or you see ghosts, or it's like, oh, a pass pawn on b3, ooh, that's it. It's like, well, hang on a minute, it's a pass pawn on b3, that's something you really should think about. So think about it. Don't just go, oh, that's a pass pawn on b3, so that's the end of me. Otherwise, you're just never going to get anywhere. So how might the game continue from here? Well, I'd take on c5. Obviously, that's a pawn that needs taking. King takes e7, and then just sort of slowly bring the king over. I mean, black's still winning this. This is a nasty pass pawn on b3, but it's nowhere near as bad as the game we just saw a minute ago, where I was just lost within about 3 moves of not doing this line. I think b3 is the best move. If black takes on a3, then I can take on c5, and after knight takes e7, I mean, we can see that white's, again, I might even start having winning ambitions there, but not really. This pawn's falling for those two, and it's just going to have led to a draw. Anyway, live and learn. That's my only example of rook versus knight in an endgame in my last 100 chess games. I remembered it very clearly because it was against the Grandmaster. I misplayed it, and I guess I'm just hoping if I just keep working on my endgames, then next time if I get a position like this, I won't misplay it, and at least I'll play it better. Next, this is a game. This isn't a study just yet, but it's not far off, to be honest, in terms of this could be a study. It's not quite bonkers. This is sort of fairly simple, but it's back to the same idea that the knight is mightier than the rook if you've got pawn chains all over the place and the rook can't get in anywhere. It's quite a close position, but also if there is a far advanced pawn that's supported by the knight. I think Dvoretsky writes that the knight can do things like deliver checks with gain of tempi, or sometimes block the rook's defense of that passed pawn promoting. That's the sort of things that the knight can do. But it's the passed pawn that's causing the trouble. Like a knight's worth 3, a rook's worth 5, and it's just like, well, what's that passed pawn worth? It looks pretty good. Anyway, black to play. Pause the video if you like, and try and find the move that black played next. If you want one final clue, after black played their next move, white resigned. So that's how good the next move is. And it's knight f3. that can't be taken. Your immediate reaction to that is like, well, that can't be taken. Okay, I just won't take it. Nice trick, but I'm just not going to take it. But there's a problem. It's like, well, okay, what are you going to do then? Because you've only got one legal move with your king. And, well, shall I leave it as an unsolved puzzle as to what black would do if white played king g2? Yeah, let's do that. Let's leave that as an unsolved puzzle. What does black play if white plays king g2 here? And once you've solved that puzzle, really difficult puzzle, that one, you might think as white, okay, so let's get rid of that problem. Let's just drop the rook up the d file. Black king comes into g5, and we could keep delivering checks if we wanted to. But what are you doing about that? Knight d4 is coming in. You know, what are we going to do about it? You think, okay, well, I'll move my rook back to d3 so that you can't block me defending the promotion of that d pawn. It's like, okay, put your rook back on d3, but then you've only got one legal king move. Like this position's just, you have no way to untangle this mess. So the only thing you can think to do, you've got to leave your rook on d3 because of, sorry, I'll spoil the puzzle. There you go. That's that puzzle sorted out. You've got to leave your rook on d3 because otherwise this d4 block, knight d4 block, you can't play king g2. So you've got to move it. You've got to leave your rook where it is. You've got to leave your king where it is. b4, and just hope that black takes it, so they're not defending the block. Black just plays b6. It's over. It's completely over. And that's what happened in this 1964 game. Black played knight f3, and white resigned.